Welcome back. This is episode 3 of the Archives Book Club, and I'm happy to be back. I know Eric's happy to be on stream. It's
Mm-hmm.
been a while for him,
Absolutely. Yeah. It's nice
and we
to
have
nice to have an excuse, right? Because right now I'm in that job hunt mode, so I'm able to kind of trick myself and be like, well, I have a commitment to Adraseth and everybody in the book club. I have to stream. I don't have a choice. I need to keep the commitment. So I get to do the fun thing without feeling the guilt of like, oh, I'm taking a day off, kind of thing.
yeah, exactly. Um, and that's actually one of the nice things about the book club, and hopefully now maybe people are starting to follow along. The first one, it was a little bit sort of incognito when we did it, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
but if you're following along, the whole point is it forces you to read these books,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's a deadline, and we're going to talk about it, and we're going to have this discussion, and so of course you can watch it later if you wanted to, and you can listen to it later if you wanted to, but if you're following along when we announce it on Twitter and in our streams, it's pretty nice to um, know what we're talking about. So when we discuss it, it's pretty obvious. And today, I guess we'll get things started, right?
Yeah,
So
for
this
sure.
is the Checklist Manifesto. This was a book that I suggested to Eret, and it's written by, and I'm going to butcher this guy's name, Atul Gawande. Hopefully that's how you say it.
I think that's pretty close. I was gonna say Gawande, but who knows?
Gawande. Okay. Um, and he is a medical doctor, and
Mm-hmm.
so the the very first thing I will just get
Oh,
right out of the way, and Eric texted me about this, or DM'd me about this right as he was listening to, because you listened to the audiobook and
yeah.
I read it, and I hadn't gotten as far as you had. I think you completed it, and I was still reading like the first few chapters,
Mm-hmm.
and you asked me, is it always going to be this kind of gory and gruesome with these little doctor stories about surgery and all this? So the book is written from a doctor's point of view, and it does have a lot of sort of, um, yeah, I cut this guy open, and then this happened, and it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It can get pretty graphic, but I would also say like so I pinged Adro about that because I don't necessarily love the super gory stuff. I am actually like a little bit squeamish when it comes to like medical stuff. Um, so I was like, dude, am I gonna have to like grit through this shit the whole time? Like, and he said he wasn't as far along in the book as me, so he didn't know. I think if you want to read this book and you're like me, right, and that stuff's a little tough for you, a lot of it is kind of front loaded. Like the intro to the book is like, here's some hardcore medical stuff, right? And then it kind of goes into some of these other, different things um, and sort of talks about other examples. And there's then medical stuff kind of peppered throughout. It's like threaded through more than like a big block of it. So you probably could read this book and like just actually skip anytime they talk about like gory hospital stuff and still do okay. You are gonna
Yeah.
miss some, but I wouldn't discount like I wouldn't disqualify yourself from being able to read it if you are squeamish, I guess.
Yeah, and I wrote down in our show notes about this specifically that the structure of the book is, it seems like, and maybe by the time we get to episode 50 or something of the Archive Book Club,
Uh
we can
huh.
just write one of these books ourselves, because I think I've discovered there's a formulaic
Mm-hmm.
plan to how these books are written. And the first part is like, let's convince you there's a problem,
Mm-hmm.
and let me give you a bunch of examples. And then it sort of details that problem and how to solve that problem. And then my solution's the best, and here's why my
Mm-hmm.
solution's the best. And so the first part of the book, the first few, it's like maybe the first chapter and a half or so, is a lot of surgery stories relating that, oh, I recognize that there is an issue.
Mm-hmm.
And then as the book progresses, like Eric's saying, if you skipped, I think you're absolutely right. If you just, every time they said surgery, you just skipped the next page or something, you
Mm-hmm.
would be fine, because there's so many other examples in the book of how checklists are implemented and how we think about complex problems and how we solve complex problems that don't involve surgery. It's just that Dr. Gawande is taking it from his point of view of I've been in the ER for a lot of years, and
Mm-hmm.
this is how I think about things. So, which
Yeah.
is understandable.
Yeah, makes sense for sure.
So kind of moving just right into the discussion, unless you had anything to add to sort of the intro
Um,
of the book.
No, I think that's a good intro. And I really like your notes for this show. So I say, let's jump into it. My brain is making ideas about things that we're not supposed to talk about yet. So I'm going to hold them.
Yeah. So I kind of broke this when I read the book, and to be clear, I actually finished the book while I was in the Black Hills. So we were doing field work and kind of in a not a completely remote area. We were pretty civilized, but a little bit of camping. And so at night I would read this book, just kind of on my Kindle, and so it's a little bit fresher for me, but I kind of organized it into three parts. It's not actually how the book is written, but it was how the book presented itself to me as a StarCraft player and as somebody
Mm,
who thinks about these complex problems and the complexity involved in problem solving.
mm-hmm.
And so the first part is, and in many ways we talk about this in StarCraft specifically, is uh, that humans are just bad at doing complex tasks, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I remember back in the Wings of Liberty days with when Day 9 was still doing the Day 9 dailies and talking about how we can't really hold so many things in our head, and so we need to have this sort of mental checklist of
Mm-hmm.
going through and doing our macro cycles. And nobody actually can multitask. We do
Right.
two tasks not simultaneously, but very quickly switching between them, and so
Mm-hmm.
on and so forth. And so there's just a couple quotes that I found like really pointed and said in an elegant way that defines sort of these things I knew about StarCraft and I knew about uh, learning something as complex as StarCraft is as a game in the book. And so the first one that I wrote down was just getting the steps right is brutally hard, even if you know them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I wanted to talk to you about because I watch your stream, and I know you haven't streamed in a little while, but
Mm-hmm.
I watch your stream and you have this sort of focus goal mindset. And most recently, I think you were doing sort of macro builds one game and then cannon rush games or kind of weirder
Mm-hmm.
printf style games the
Yeah.
other, and going back and forth. And I remember you, especially in the cannon rush games, which is I think is really funny because you would think the macro games are more complex, but the
Mm-hmm.
cannon rush games get real complex real quickly.
Yeah.
I remember you would say stuff like, oh shoot, I'm supposed to build X
Right.
and I didn't do that, and you were kind of chastising yourself. And this quote from the book is like exactly that. It's like
Mm-hmm.
getting, if you, even if you know what to do,
Yeah.
it's so hard to do it in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was just a like beautifully pointed quote. I don't know if you have anything to add. I can just go to the next quote
I
too.
I would just say, I think it's really interesting, and especially that you picked out that thread in my stream because for whatever reason I wasn't thinking about myself. You're totally right. I do this. I was just thinking about like literally every stream that I watch where people are playing StarCraft. After somebody will lose the game, they'll be like, ah, damn it, there's this one thing I needed to do and I just didn't do it, and I know I need to do it. And it's like we've all said that, right? Anybody who's
Yeah.
devoted even a small amount of effort to trying to get better at this game has had that thing where it's like you're almost scolding yourself like a parent, right? It's like, you know better. Why didn't you do the thing? And it's like, because getting the steps right is brutally hard, even if you know them, right? Like it, yeah, I'm totally on board with this one.
Yeah. That the scolding like a parent too, and it goes a bit into the mentality side of StarCraft in that um, we're usually very hard on ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
At least I would say at least us diamond players, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and probably the masters players and above, like we're really hard on ourselves when it comes to if I just put my shield battery down, or
Mm-hmm.
the last game I just lost this game 10 minutes ago and I didn't build Tempest in time, and I needed Tempest. I know I needed Tempest, and I didn't build them. And if I just had Tempest, and I thought that to myself. I didn't say it out loud, I don't think, but I was like, if I just have Tempest, I win the game right here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I don't have it, and it's part of the build. It's where I needed to be in the build order, and I just didn't do it.
Right.
So the next one is the avoidable failures are common and persistent, not to mention demoralizing and frustrating. And it's right along in this
Mm-hmm.
vein of thinking that um, when you're playing StarCraft or when you're doing anything complex, It could be learning an instrument. It could be playing chess. It could be playing StarCraft. Uh, you sort of know the right thing to do, but you still don't do it.
Mm-hmm.
And then you're just like, am I ever gonna be able to do this?
Yeah.
Like, how many times, like, people in chat just, raise a hand. How many times have you thought that to yourself? Am I ever gonna be able to do this?
Mm-hmm.
And I know I've had that feeling, and probably you've had that feeling as well, Eric.
Yeah. Yeah. And I actually, you made the comment earlier that this is, at least on the last point, really common in like, the diamond and above kind of category. But, I follow a lot of different people in the community on Twitter. And I keep a pretty good eye on that even when I'm like less involved in the scene. Like I will actually stay up to date with that even if I'm not necessarily current on like GSL or other major tournaments. Unless I specifically know that I'm going to get caught up, and then I'll avoid Twitter, right? Um, but
Yeah.
I've seen gold and silver league players who are heavily involved in the community, right? These are people who run community groups and tournaments. And I need to mute my phone.
So
um,
I should do the
uh,
same.
um, yeah. So I've seen these people. So demoralized that they're like, I don't know why I play this game, or I got to take a long break. Like I just, I'm stuck. I can't improve. And I mean, this is, as low as Gold and Silver League, where, for me, I felt like there were a lot of things that were just low hanging fruit to improve, right? So it's, I don't think this is league dependent. I think it's like you can get stuck almost anywhere and get into this
Yeah.
mindset.
I felt the same way in to kind of relate to maybe gold, silver, bronze league players, because that's been a long time since I was in those leagues. But
Mm-hmm.
when I started playing more Brood War recently this year, I started doing 2 days a week streaming Brood War,
Mm-hmm.
and it's so hard to enter that scene because the players who do play, even the like quote unquote bad ones, have been playing for a lot longer than you have as a new player,
Mm-hmm.
and they do things that are seemingly impossible, right? Like mechanically, it's like how could I possibly do that in such, and I barely understand the compositions of these units, and I barely understand the build orders, and then the game is very different in the way it plays, and yet I need to be able to micro and do all that, and it's like, I'm never going to get there. I should just
Yeah.
quit. And I think Brood War is a great example of this, because the wall you hit so quickly is very tall and very hard to get over. But if
Mm-hmm.
you get over it, if you do stay with it, it will come, and it does, like, as a little side tangent motivation thing,
Mm-hmm.
it does get a little easier, and it does like feel very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
But it is incredibly frustrating when you think about, I know what to do and I can't do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just keep staying with this thread for just a second. Like, there are a lot of games where you have this. Like, I think Brood War is a very extreme example, right? Smash Melee would be another very extreme example. But I've even heard this
Yeah.
in like the Spellbreak scene, where like, that game's a BR. It's meant to be a pretty pretty chill experience, but it was in a NDA closed alpha for so long that there's 40 or 50 players who are just absolute gods at it, and they're actually having issues with the community right now because people go to play it and they just get absolutely ripped apart by it'll just be like one of those alpha players on that night,
Yeah.
and it's like, well, I'm not gonna do this. Like, I'm getting my ass kicked. Like, this isn't fun. I'm gonna go play whatever, Apex or Overwatch or whatever the hell other
Right.
flavor of the month shooter there is, kind of thing. So I think it's a pretty persistent thing kind of across games.
That's a really interesting thing to watch. And I remember a couple years ago when Dead by Daylight came out, and I thought it was a fun game, and I bought it and I played a little bit of it. And I used to watch streamers. This is even back when I lived out west. So I used to watch East Coast streamers, like when I ate dinner,
Mm-hmm.
play it. And it was so interesting how everybody was sort of learning the game at the same time, but there were clear and obvious people who were just better than everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of it had to do with, like, oh, they were in the beta,
Yep.
or, oh, they had some, insider information of how the game works. And so
Mm-hmm.
they already understood the game in a way that other players didn't. And both StarCraft 1 and StarCraft 2 went through this. We know that, right? Like, if you watch Wing Celebrity GSL, it's like, oh, damn, I could have been in that GSL, right?
Right. Yeah.
but the way we understand the game and the way that the game has evolved and the meta has evolved because humans are playing it and involved in the game changes things, and it does make it very difficult. It's a hard thing for game developers to balance, that the entry level fun is not so easy that it deflects from the game being complex and having a high skill ceiling, but also it's inviting enough for new people to still get hooked on it and say, yeah, this is really fun and I feel accomplishment when I play the game. As opposed to some games which are like, hooking you on a addiction level. Like StarCraft is I feel accomplished when I play that game. That's the difference that gets you hooked.
Right.
So it is a very interesting dynamic, and I think I think everyone can kind of agree, especially if you played any RTS. It's like knowing what to do right and still getting it wrong is really demoralizing. And that's what this book is really about, is how do we solve that problem? And this presents one thesis on how you can do it, but there are other ways to do it too, I think, and that's something we wanted to discuss as well. So the final quote here, and then we can just go straight into more discussion, is that it says, "The art of managing extreme complexity and a test of whether such complexity can be humanly mastered." So the context of that statement is that some things feel so complex that they may seem impossible to achieve. And this would be the analogy I thought of, was I will never make it to master, or I'll never make it to GM, or whatever your next league up is, because it's just too complex. I can't do it.
Yep.
And that quote comes around the story of the B-29 bomber, or the bomber that basically test pilots died in, and there was like, no one could possibly fly this plane. It's impossible. And it turned out to be one of the most important aircraft built by the United States Air Force during the World War II, and I think afterwards. And so it's like, sometimes when we approach problems, we look at them and say, yeah, there's no way, and just give up.
Yep.
And that's really not the right mindset. And I think, especially your stream, Eric, I think you really emphasize this, especially well, in that, yeah, let's not focus on this is impossible. Let's focus on what we can do right. So
yeah,
it's pretty commendable.
I've felt kind of stuck for a good while. So I don't know. It's funny. It's funny hearing you say all these nice things about my mindset, because I do feel like I'm a little bit in the struggle right now. I mean, obviously I'm not playing super actively and streaming just because my life is on fire. But when I do make the inevitable comeback and shake off the rust, I'm not looking forward to being in that same, like, oh gosh, I'm dealing with these same freaking problems, and I just can't seem to get over the hump. So I don't know. We're all feeling
sometimes
it, right?
that's also worse, right? Because you're like, I used to do this, and now I can't, because I've lost some skill, or I've lost some control or dexterity, or whatever it is. Yeah, it's tough. I think though, on the whole, like the way that you have approached StarCraft, and the way that a lot of your viewership approaches StarCraft, is the correct way to go, right? The because it's just so easy to be like, oh god, this game's hard to quit. Like, I had 2 Terran players tonight, just really salty, giving me all this stuff. Oh, Protoss so easy. I can't beat Protoss. I'll never. And it's like, well, geez, is every Terran in the entire world, 33% of the player base or whatever it is, stuck in Diamond because they can never beat a Protoss?
Yeah,
like,
sit trapped, or not trapped. Sit Maru down against Adrasens.
yeah, like, I'm just gonna win a game, like, no problem, right? And it has to do with, it feels that way, even though it's not. And we would like to, and actually I heard this on some I think the Tasteless podcast I was listening to. He talks a little bit about this mindset of that you would love to blame something other than yourself. And that's what the mind tries to do, because it wants to kind of protect the ego, but it's not it's just your skill level, and it's just a normal progression of building up skill, and there's different ways of doing that, but like
Mm-hmm.
that's the normal progression. So
So I want to stick with that for just a second because actually think that's fascinating that thing you just said, that mindset of like, I'm going to blame something else to protect the ego and whatever. It fascinates me that that is so prevalent, specifically within StarCraft, right? Like, you see it in games, right? But look, I dabble in other games, right, from time to time. I swear I feel like I see it more in StarCraft sometimes, and it baffles me because to me, the point and one of the most redeeming qualities of StarCraft 2 is that it very explicitly that statement isn't true, right? It isn't like I'm playing Arena and I'm griping to Adeline in the other room like, can you believe what this guy just drew? He drew a third one,
mhm.
babe, and I'm shouting across the house like, hey, I'm so much saltier playing that than StarCraft because like there's actually RNG, right? Or
Yeah,
there's deck building choices that are like objectively wrong, right? And then somebody does it and you lose and you're like, this is so stupid. Why am I losing to
yeah.
this, right? Whereas in StarCraft, like I've always looked at it and just known, look, the other human won. It's because they're better. Like, so I find it odd that exists in StarCraft, and I think it's a big misstep on the part of a lot of folks in the community because to me that property of StarCraft is a very very useful property that is rare in the world, right? You can get that in physical sports, right? Where
Hmm.
the other person beat you at tennis because they're better, faster, stronger, more experienced, smarter, whatever it is. But that isn't the case in a lot of mental sports, right? Because there are these things like RNG in card games or whatnot.
So did you do any competitive sports like tennis, swimming, anything that you're the only thing other than
No,
team sports?
no, I only did team stuff and only when I was pretty young. So
Okay.
a little bit of weird backstory that I don't think I've talked about on stream or at least not on the archives. I broke my leg when I was 2.
Oh,
So I actually learned to walk twice in life.
wow.
And I don't know this for sure, but I feel like it put me behind the curve pretty badly in terms of like coordination and stuff. Because I was like a pretty chubby kid growing up, which probably also didn't help. Like maybe eat a few less Pop Tarts kind of thing. But like the combination of that made sports not as fun because I just wasn't that good.
Hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I mean, it's one of those like correlation isn't always causation, but it
Mm-hmm.
sounds right. If like, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
if you break your leg when you're young, probably your coordination is not great. But
Mm-hmm.
do we have a big test bed of a
Right.
thousand kids who broke their leg to
Mm-hmm.
see? Um, yeah, I didn't. I played like mostly just kind of recreation sports. I didn't participate in really like I didn't have a little league dad that pushed me into
Mm-hmm.
sports really hard.
Mm-hmm.
But I did when I was adult get into cycling pretty deeply,
Mm-hmm.
and I was racing when I was in college, and I was doing a lot of uh, criterions and single day stage races or 2 day stage races was like stuff that we do. And if you're into cycling, this makes sense to you. I did time trials and criterions and all that stuff. But cycling in the Tour de France, it's a team sport, but in the most part, when you're
Mm-hmm.
moving up as an amateur trying to like get good, and I was like, I want to go for a pro, like I
Mm-hmm.
want to try,
Yeah.
and I was definitely not good enough, and there's a lot of reasons why I was not good enough, but um, I rarely found that I wanted to blame like my equipment
Mm.
or somebody else. I just got depressed and like, I'm not good enough.
Yeah.
That was the mindset I had back then. And I would still train and I'd work hard, but every time I would just get like meh results. I'd be like, okay, out of a pack of 50 dudes, I'd finish 25.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, I'm just C plus, average
Mm-hmm.
guy here. Like,
Right.
so it was kind of like, well, you know, I wanted to do better, but I didn't do better. But I do distinctly remember not thinking like, oh, this is bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in StarCraft, I think that all the time, right? I don't always vocalize it,
Right.
but I'm just like, the ranged liberator is some
Uh-huh.
stupid bullshit, and I know, like I know that that's the emotion and the heat of the moment that's coming
Mm-hmm.
out. But it's much easier to do that. For some reason, it's easier to do that in StarCraft than it
Hmm.
is for other stuff that I've done. And I don't understand why that is. I don't understand why I'm so invested in the game and why we all get invested in the game. It's kind of an interesting side topic, but
Mm-hmm.
it does bring out that hot emotion like, oh man, can you believe Widow Mines, or can you believe the Baneling?
All they have to do is drop one Widow
Gosh.
Mine. If I don't react, I lose. Yeah.
Yeah. Nidus? Oh gosh.
This is
It's the
great
kind
because
of stuff.
we're both Protoss mains, right? So like this is
Yeah,
the
right.
only time you ever hear this particular vein of balance whining.
Well, I'm pretty sure it's required that if you're gonna do a talk show, you can only play Protoss. That seems like
Yeah,
the the community guidelines.
that's probably about right. Oh man.
So something to get into this mindset of like, how do we? Okay, so we've sort of identified the problem, and how do we and I don't know if this is me trying to convince Eric, but I think that the checklist manifesto is a good idea for StarCraft. And I don't know that if making checklists actually works. I've tried this a little bit
Mm-hmm.
since I finished the book and have been playing, but I'm curious to hear your opinion. But one thing that I highlighted is that I said most of us think that we don't have to do anything more. Once we win a game, we're like, okay, I got it.
Mm-hmm.
I can beat Zerg or I can beat Protoss. I don't need to do anything more. And then we just keep doing the same build or we
Mm-hmm.
keep doing the same strategy. And then one day it doesn't work anymore. And we have no idea why. And that's definitely my experience. I hope that other people have experienced that too. Not that I want you to lose, but I think that that's pretty common. And I could give you the anecdote of I remember back about a year and a half, almost 2 years ago, where I was rushing carriers every single game against Zerg, and I was just rolling people, and they were so salty. And I had seen like on Reddit, somebody was like, "This build's amazing, you should do it," and I was like, "Yeah, I'm winning games," and then it just hit a wall. It just
Mm-hmm.
stopped, and I was like, "What's going on? Why isn't this working?" And then of course what I started doing was I started changing things, but I didn't have any systematic plan.
Mm-hmm.
I was just like, well, I'll get more void rays, or maybe I should get a couple zealots first, and then it's like you never actually had a way to test what was working, what wasn't, and
Mm-hmm.
why it didn't work. And was it just one game or a couple games where you played off and so this kind of builds into this idea of having a checklist which doesn't change is maybe an effective way to identify problems, or it's also maybe an effective way to prevent problems.
Mm. So this one's interesting to me because I think that it's true, and it's true on several different layers. Like we can scope in different ways. To you're laughing because this is a computer scientist thing to say. I know.
No,
Um,
actually, I was just reading my chat, and Lord
uh,
Richard said he's going to leave the chat in a fit of Terran rage.
well, in my chat, Blaze for it said about the exact same thing at the exact same time. So Terran rep keeping his ears shut over here. So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's funny. One of those
We'll tone it. We'll
signals.
tone it down. We'll tone it down.
One of them said it at 7:59, the other at 8. So that was very,
Okay.
very nice solidarity there across the two Twitch chats.
Yeah.
So I think this is true on different levels. So there's the level you're saying where it's like I pick my build, right? And I do my build and I just abuse it until I meet people who are, not going to get cheesed out by this thing because they've never seen it before, right? Like,
Hmm.
people do this with like worker rushes and Zerg and stuff where like you can get to a certain MMR and people just literally like I kind of don't even know what to do when people do it to me, right? And it's just like, oh,
Yeah.
I guess this works because I'm too dumb to know how to respond to it, right? Like, um, so there's that, right? And I think that one gets a lot of people into kind of a feel bad mindset because kind of as you're describing, right? You're like, well, okay, should I do this? Should I get Void Ray? Should I get Zealots? Whatever. Like, it's like you're looking for the answer. I think everybody starts out this way in StarCraft. You're like, well, what build do I have to go to win all my games, right? And
Yeah.
like that's not how it works, but that's kind of how we all come in. It's like, okay, there's all these units and all these choices, and it's very overwhelming. Can somebody just tell me what I should build if I want to win, right?
It's the so-called silver bullet,
Mm-hmm.
really.
Yeah. So I think that's one. I think another one is what you're saying about overlooking improvements you can make. So I'm going to pat myself on the back about this one because this is like one of the only things that I think I'm doing right in my StarCraft game right now, which is even the games where I win, I'm usually pretty cognizant of like at least a couple of the mistakes. It might not be the most important ones, but I kind of go back and I'll call it out. And I try to do it every game if I can. Chat will be, hyped. They're like, oh, we won, cool, whatever. And I'll be like, yeah, we won, but I didn't hallucinate. And if they'd gone mutas, we straight up lose, right? Something like that.
Hmm.
Um, so I think that's a big deal. Um, and then the last one, what was the last one? Uh-oh. Oh, so I've seen people do this thing where, so the statement is, most of us think that there's no need to do any more than is required to get a win until we're not winning anymore. I've seen people do this within a game. So I'm not even talking about post-match analysis or sticking to one build. I'm talking about you get ahead and you let off the gas a little bit, right?
Hmm.
I don't do this as much personally, but I know this is a very common like psychological thing a lot of players fall into, where they start to meme around, style on the opponent a little bit, right? And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden it's a close game, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I shouldn't have like just only made BCs at this point or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So kind of interesting the different layers of this exact same phenomenon.
Yeah, and I think you're right about the when you're playing StarCraft, and as you learn StarCraft and you learn more of the game, you do sort of search for this like, well, there must be a correct build that just beats everything else, or
Mm-hmm.
there must be a unit that will win the
Mm-hmm.
game. And I think that no more now than ever before in the history of StarCraft is that less true when
Mm-hmm.
you look at players like Haas or Serral when they played at IEM a year ago, whatever it
Mm-hmm.
was. And the two styles were so vastly different. And probably a lot of people would see Haas play and say, well, that's just bad and that's just wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I've seen it happen to you on stream where you cannon rush and somebody will say, well, you're never going to get better because you're
Mm-hmm.
cannon rushing.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, boy, you don't understand anything about the gameplay, do you?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, and I've been playing around with cannon rushes the last couple days, and today none of them worked, and yesterday a bunch of them worked, and it
Mm-hmm.
was like, okay. So there's so many different ways to play StarCraft. There's so many different ways to approach StarCraft that the sort of silver bullet win everything build doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't. It's so much more important to identify the problems, like you're saying, like, oh, I didn't mute a scout. And I do want to get into that in kind of a little bit later in the
Mm-hmm.
discussion about the book, because the the thing that leads into is, well, if we're going to use checklists, which I still I'm still on the fence of whether or not that's actually effective for StarCraft.
Mm-hmm.
But if we're going to do it, how do we actually build the checklist? Because there is a big part of the book that does talk about making a good checklist
Mm-hmm.
versus a bad checklist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And for the author, the stakes are much higher being a doctor because we're talking about people dying,
Mm-hmm.
right, on his operating table, or part of the book is involved with a program with the World Health Organization to improve healthcare throughout the world. And these are literally life or death type of
Mm-hmm.
decisions that need to be made. So it's kind of interesting. So you had the next point that on our notes, and maybe you want to lead us into that.
Yeah. So kind of what I wrote is the book kind of goes into like the mechanism of these types of failures a little bit. So okay, squeamish warning for the next 10 seconds. Cover your ears if you don't want to hear medical stuff. So one of the failures they talk about is any time that you've got tubes in your body, right? Like you have an extended stay in the ER or whatever, and for whatever reason they got to shove tubes into you, different lines to do different stuff, put saline in you or whatever the hell it is. That there's like a very very simple list of things that need to happen, right? You have to clean things a certain way, you have to replace things every so often, very very simple. People need to wash their hands before they're doing stuff. You can't touch one patient, touch another patient. There's just basic rules, right? And the statistic on it was staggering. It was like if you had it, I'm going to butcher this, but it was something to the effect of like if you're in there for like 5 days or week or something like that, there was like a 79% chance of infection if you have tubes in you. It's like, holy crap, dude, that's horrifying. Like, I
Yeah, it
guess
was
all
really
the,
high.
the like everybody kind of has that one family member that's like, get me the hell out of the hospital, whatever. Like, if anything ever happens, they like want to be dragged
Yeah.
out no matter what. And it's like, oh, that family member who everybody thought was crazy is right, because statistically speaking, like if they're in there for more than 5 days, they're screwed, right?
Yeah.
Um, and this isn't like, oh, like no big deal infection, like pop a couple antibiotics and you're no problem. Like it could be really bad. Um, so okay, that's, you can unearmuff now if you earmuffed.
Yeah.
But the mechanisms that they described are very simple, right? It's things like, oh, I assumed somebody else, swapped out the thing or cleaned it or whatever. Or, yeah, I mentally cue the task, right? Like, okay, cool. I'm gonna, once I finish talking to the patient and writing down this information, I'm gonna clean the thing, and then I'm gonna go get their thing of pills, right? And then somebody goes, oh, hey, Aaron, uh, what did you do with this other patient? And I turn and I go, oh yeah, it was this. And then I go and I'm like, all right, cool, got to get you your pills, and I go get the pills, right? And I never cleaned whatever the thing was. Um,
Right.
and so that one I think is obviously more common in StarCraft, right? Because I'm not going to assume somebody else did something. Um, Sometimes I guess you assume that you did it, but that's kind of the same as the mentally queuing and getting interrupted thing. It's like you
Hmm.
you thought you did. Maybe they're slightly different, but it's like you thought you did it and you just didn't. This is like the I forgot Warp Gate or I never got Storm, right? And then you have 10 High Templar with full energy and you go try to use Storm and you look back at your Templar archives and feel
It's not
very sad.
that's well, that's a sad day if you're a Protoss
Just
player.
hold
I'll
down the
tell you
C key
what.
and proceed to lose the game. It's not
Yeah,
good.
like okay.
Yeah, this is a very expensive paperweight that I have here.
Yeah, this is especially in StarCraft, I think this happens a lot because it's really interesting. I tried to think about this. It was a while ago, but relating the StarCraft to other games, and like a lot of people talk about chess and all that, but one of the things that makes StarCraft very difficult to learn and get better at is that there is an opponent that's actively trying to thwart your progress.
Hmm.
And if you, let's say you want to get better at chess, I think a lot of people would agree that you can practice endgame positions, and that really helps you improve your chess game overall. Um, and you can do little quizzes, and there's apps for your phone where it pops up with a daily quiz of like what's the best move for white or black or
Hmm.
whatever. And it's just sort of like if you do that, you will improve,
Hmm.
and nobody's gonna slap the phone out of your hand mid answer.
Hmm.
But in StarCraft, it's like, okay, I'm gonna try this new build, and okay, I'm gonna do this, and then oh shit, there's banelings at my door, and
Right.
then like the whole thing comes off the rails.
Yeah.
And so this is where I think um, possibly the most effective use of checklists could be done, and maybe this all could be mental, but I do think that it's common for me. I know I do it all the time where I'm like, oh, I thought I built X building and I
Hmm.
don't have it, or I thought I queued it up and I messed up the probe, or the worker rally or something.
Hmm.
um, and then it's like, well, now what do I do? There's not really a roadmap, because we can all. So one of the things that I wanted to make clear also about the book is that I don't think that this means we should all sit down and practice build orders more.
Mm.
Because if you think of like, oh, what's a checklist? Like the build order is the literal checklist for
Yeah, true.
StarCraft, and I don't think that's actually really effective. I think it's possibly good for lower league players to kind of get a sense of what they should have at certain times,
Hmm.
and I mean lower, like lower than gold, maybe silver and bronze. Like, okay, you probably shouldn't build 3 nexuses right away. You should
Hmm.
build a whatever, or you should get a barracks before you take your expansion, something like that.
If any of them are
Um,
expanding at that lowly, I'm so proud of them because
I
I
mean,
didn't
it's
do
still pretty
it.
good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you're still in the stage of like, what does this unit do? Oh,
Hmm.
this is a cool looking building, right? So
Yeah.
but like practicing build orders, being really really good at build orders, and I think the paragon of this is E.G. Machine. I don't know if anybody remembers E.G. Machine, but he was a player that was on E.G. at the time that Idra was doing well, And he was known, I think he played a lot of Brood War, and he was known for just grinding the shit out of build orders.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he got the name Machine. So supposedly, I could be totally wrong about this story, but I
I've
believe
heard
that's
that story
correct.
too. I think that's right.
And it's like, well, that will make you better, but it doesn't really deal with these sort of unforeseen consequences of, oh crap, I just got attacked and I lost half my workers. Now what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
Or, oh, I'm not tactically in a great position to fight here. Do I actually take the engagement? Or there's a drop in my main and my army is all the way across the map. Do I come back? Do I stay over there?
Mm-hmm.
Do I do the base trade? Do I not do the base? All those things are really like not part of your build order, right? There's no part of your build order that says, yeah, you should go ahead with the base trade, right?
Yep.
And I think that this is where the checklist idea really could shine, is that when stuff gets weird in a StarCraft game, maybe that's time we, and it's hard because the game's really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So, but maybe that's time we take a moment and say, okay, does this qualify for any of these weird situations? And can I use a checklist to get me out of this situation or get me into the best possible situation for my, for a victory?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that essentially going along with that is this, like in the book, it kind of goes into like pilots and it talks about aviators a lot in the book because they're the ones that use checklists. And so I don't know if we want to close that thought anymore, Eric, or do you want to move on and talk about pilots?
Yeah, I mean, I don't totally know what else I would say about it other than, for anybody who's, checking us out tonight who hasn't read the book, that was just something that I found interesting. I don't totally know. So we keep dancing around this issue of like, can you do checklists in StarCraft, right? And I think you kind of want to do that towards the end, right? So I can save my thoughts there.
Yeah. I think I want to just get through a little bit more about what's interesting about pilots and aviators using checklists, and then like, okay, so that's all great and fine. We've had a nice little discussion about a book, but like the whole point is that we try and implement this into StarCraft, and it's related to StarCraft. So one of the things that I wrote down as I was kind of going through the book and remembering and taking notes was that there are a number of different examples of pilots in the book, and checklists becoming used in sort of like the 50s, 60s, which is sort of the birth of modern aviation with the military, the Air Force actually branching out, at least in the United States, the Air Force branching out from the Army and then test pilots and all this sort of stuff that was going on during the Cold War. And one of the things that was decided is that pilots don't need more training, right? So they were having issues with different things. So for example, like I said, the bomber example where this bomber was very dangerous and people were dying, and it wasn't that putting them in more training wasn't necessarily the right choice. And so checklists were sort of introduced, and part of the reason why, and this is something that I don't know if you ever listened to the podcast Hello Internet.
No.
Okay, it's an interesting one, but it's just like two dudes talking about random stuff. But one of the things that they talk about a lot on there is that humans are really, really bad at remembering stuff. And if you've ever sat on a jury, if you've ever done jury duty and sat on a jury, and I've done it a couple times, you will learn very quickly that humans, two people in the same room witnessing the same thing happening, will tell it completely differently. And it's not that they'll say like, oh, it was, somebody had a gun and the other person said, no, they had a katana sword, right? Like that's not, those kind of details are okay. But it's like, oh, this guy was wearing a blue shirt and actually he was wearing, the other person will say a red shirt. And it's like, well, now the witness's credibility comes into question.
Right.
And so pilots are trained that their memory and their judgment can be unreliable in stressful situations and in complex situations. And that's exactly what happens in a crime or a car accident or anything that gets complex quickly, is that our brains just sort of get overloaded. And humans are very good at like ignoring details and focusing on, the important stuff like getting out alive or whatever it may be. And so this is why that was kind of the reasoning why checklists were used for flying, is that there are times where, shit's going to get real and the pilot may not be able to actually remember what they're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do or make the right judgment call of what they're
Mm-hmm.
supposed to do. Whereas a piece of paper doesn't change.
Right.
And that was an interesting point for me to think about in many different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the things that they talk about too are aimed at getting you, like, I guess, forcing you back to what your training was trying to enforce, right? So, a good example of this is not trusting your gauges, right? Your gauges
Yeah.
say you're flying at the ground, right? And you're like, well, doesn't look like it to me, right? Gauge must be busted, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so some of the checklist stuff is like, well, okay, if your gauge says you're pointed at the ground and you don't feel like you're pointed at the ground and it doesn't look like you're pointed at the ground, do this, this, and this to figure out whether you're broken or the gauge is broken. And it kind of like, if you have a process, then you can unscrew yourself from, flying straight into the ground and dying, which like is a very real thing that actually happens apparently.
It's happened. Yeah. Yeah. It's sort of this, what is it? There's a phrase for it, but it's basically, we think we're better at making judgment calls than we actually are. Like, we
Hmm.
think we're better experts than we really are
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
Um,
Are you talking about like the
and
Dunning-Kruger thing?
yeah, maybe that's what
Okay.
it is
Okay.
like we basically assume that we're right
Mm-hmm.
more than we probably should.
Yeah, so the thing I'm referencing is like that, but directly proportional to how bad you are at the thing, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
So,
Overestimation of your skill level, right?
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Yeah. And I think this is 200% what we do in StarCraft. Like, I should beat that guy.
yeah,
Come on. Are you kidding me?
right. Did you
That
see?
that opponent. Did you see what they did?
Yeah, did you see their composition? It's terrible.
It's terrible. I'm
Yeah,
better than that.
right.
Whatever. I mean, that's why it's so fun about these books, is that when you do put the context of StarCraft as you read them, you're just like, oh, right. Yeah, that's me.
Mm-hmm,
I'm right there, because like you can just check the boxes of like, yep, I do that. I do that
mm-hmm,
too. Yep, I do that. Um, so part of the reasoning for again, coming back to the pilots, is that the idea is that in these stressful situations, the checklists force the correct decision making, or the correct line of actions,
mm-hmm,
right? So it was sort of forcing functions.
mm-hmm.
And it's even said in the book something like that the checklist is the way that it delivers the correct behavior.
Yeah.
It forces you to do the correct behavior. and
Mm-hmm,
and I think that's really important in StarCraft. Obviously, there is a level of strategy involved in StarCraft, and I don't think that checklist should modify that, right? If you
mm-hmm,
have some grand scheme and you want to execute it in a game. However, there are things that are mechanically very important in StarCraft that there really isn't a wrong answer for, right?
mm-hmm,
Like, or there isn't another option for. Like, yes, you pretty much need to expand if you want to get into the light game.
mm-hmm,
You're going to run out of minerals, and if you run out of minerals, you can't build army, and if you can't build army, you're not going to really last into the late game.
mm-hmm.
Of course, there's exceptions to everything, but in general, there are things like that you need to take into account. And I think the old adage that, I don't know actually who said it first, but we can give Artosis the credit of, when you're attacking, expand, and when they're expanding, you attack, and that sort of thing, right? There are these general rules that are pretty consistent and pretty solid throughout the game, and
Mm-hmm.
those sort of things don't necessarily change, right? And but you can forget them if things get too complex.
Mm-hmm.
So you can have, the way I think about it is, you can have this game plan for strategy, what you want to do, but there are still fundamental things that you need to check on, and upgrades and
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It depends how you
Mm-hmm.
play the game, but um, I think that's where checklists can really benefit.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
now, like I say, like now, okay, we can get into the checklist discussion, because that's the lead in that I wanted to give.
Sure, yeah. Um, so I'm glad that you're taking this position because my takeaway from it was So I'm not a person that likes to write stuff down, right? Just me in life in general, right? I hate taking notes. I hated it in school if they ever made me do it. I think I've said that on the show before.
Hmm.
And I don't like it for, so like right now I'm interviewing in a million places and I gotta like write what time what call is in Google Calendar, and I hate it. It feels so gross. It disgusts me that I can't track it in my own mind, right? But I know that
Yeah.
I'm overloaded right now, so I'm doing it. So I didn't even want to be on board with the idea of doing a checklist ever for anything, right? So I came into this book as like the absolute target audience, right? I'm like,
Oh, this is so great. I'm glad that you read it then.
yeah, 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 for sure. Um, so I've also said on the show before that I love being wrong about stuff, right? It's just so much more interesting. Like I don't need one more pat on the back for being smart. Like I can compile code and feel that, anytime I need to, right? So yeah, I definitely, in reading the book, was sold on the idea that checklists are an important thing for critical processes in life and that I should be using them for that. And I haven't done it yet, but I'm totally on board that like this is a thing. And I can think of things in like my professional life where, okay, maybe I'm going to do a deployment of some code and maybe there's some complications to that where I'm, migrating some, schema from one thing to another. It's not just a straightforward like you drop the new code in there and you're good, right? There's certain things that need to happen in a certain order. I could totally see how checklisting that makes sense. Where I could not see a use for this is StarCraft, and so I'm glad that you're taking the position that there is one. Because one, I couldn't find it, and then two, it means we can argue about it a little bit, which is kind of interesting
Yeah.
and good. Um, what I would say that I did think of as I was kind of, kicking that around in my head is that I think um, the the day 9 mental checklist exercise, right? It's like daily number 362 or 65 or something like that, right?
Wow.
It's like
You got it on right off the top of your head. I like
this
that.
is one of the weird things my brain is. They're probably both wrong, right? But that's like what my brain wants to say it is. Um, I don't think that is the same thing that Atul Gawande is talking about. I think that what Day Nine's talking about is more like when so back to like fighter pilots and aviators and stuff, right?
Hmm.
They have like their OODA loop thing, like orient, whatever the hell the other O is, decide and act, right?
Yeah.
Um, it's like observe, orient, decide, act, something like that.
Yeah.
Um, I think Day Nine's thing is closer to that than it is to a checklist, and the reason I say that is that in the book, he's very specifically saying, like, if you have a list in your head of the things you need to do to clean the tubes for this patient, you're going to not do some of that stuff some of the time. And so that, to me, sounds like the day 9 mental checklist is what, like, the doctor or the nurse is doing in that example. So I don't think that I want to use that for that.
Hmm.
But also, as you were talking about StarCraft and certain situations where it's like, okay, if it's a base trade, and it's this matchup, then maybe I want to try to do one of these three things in descending priority order, right? So,
Hmm.
like, maybe it's a PvP and we both have Dark Shrines, right? One of the things Coach HJax has taught me is you establish a stronghold. You put a shitload of cannons by a nexus and you go, I get to mine. Now, what are you doing across the map, right? And at
Hmm.
least then we've established that piece of it, right?
Hmm.
Um, so there's little things like that where it's like you can bake that in ahead of time where it's like if I see this situation, this is the thing I do. And you can do it in build orders too, right? Where, back to my Muta thing, like in my Adept thing, which by the way is a great example of what you were talking about with the carriers, where like the build breaks down in a certain MMR. Every time I get close to Diamond 1, it stops working. Um,
Hmm.
but that thing, that build, has a moment in it where it's like, and then you check for mutas. If you don't, you could lose. You might not. They didn't
Hmm.
make them, but you'll lose if they did. Um,
Hmm.
and so you can bake that into that situation too, which isn't like a random thing that happens to you. It's a part of the build. And if you don't do this part of the build, you could straight lose. Um, so I think that's useful, but I don't think I call it a checklist in the Atul Gawande, the checklist manifesto kind of a sense.
Yeah. So I agree with you partly, and I disagree with you partly,
Okay.
and I think that's kind of interesting. So I think for okay, so I'm going to come back to your adept build order thing in a second because I think
Sure.
that's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of checklists, I think that for let's say the infection tube thing, right? Because he comes up with that as an example. I think it
Mm-hmm.
was done at Johns Hopkins, and they have like data and it shows like, oh, the checklist works very well.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very simple thing, and it's a very I mean, you don't have to go to medical school to know to follow his checklist.
Mm-hmm.
It's like any one of us could wash our hands, put gloves on, and do it, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's I mean, maybe you wouldn't want to do it, but you could do it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not like it's really hard. It's not really intensive in the brain, like you don't have to think a lot about it, but it was getting missed. And so I think that one of the things that he identifies, but he doesn't say in the book, but I believe that this is sort of what I gleaned out of the context of it, is that in the medical field, there are certain things that could be missed that are such high stakes
Mm.
that they ought not to be, and therefore there should be a checklist for them.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody gets an infection post-op, they can die because their immune system is weakened. Their body's not strong. And a very simple, like 3-point checklist that the nurse goes over as they change whatever fluids, things, that they do in the hospital, would save that person. That essentially could save that person's life. And, there's so squeamish warning, because there's another example towards the end of the book where he saves somebody's life, and he's doing a removal of a tumor, and he messes up and he cuts a major vein or artery or something where the tumor was next to, and the guy almost bleeds out. And the reason he doesn't bleed out is because they had done the checklist in the beginning, and they had gotten the blood for in case of an emergency to do a transfusion if they needed to, and the guy survives. And so there is this sort of like, no duh, right? Like some of these things are like, yeah, you should have antibiotics ready for your patient because they could get an infection, but they're still getting missed because the complexity of the situation is so high.
Mm-hmm.
And in their case, in medical fields, it's a team.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
flying is often a team thing when you think of commercial or whatever, or whatever, so military teams, but sometimes it's solo.
Mm-hmm.
And so flying is a little bit different because there are checklists for a single pilot. If you're flying a Cessna alone, you have checklists.
Mm-hmm.
If your engine gives out, do these things to try and restart the engine. So I feel like for the author, the purpose of the checklist and the design of the checklist is actually quite different than that of a pilot. Because it's not like he made the bad incision and the patient was bleeding a lot and then they went to the checklist. It was actually the checklist way before they started that saved the patient's life.
Mm-hmm.
And the comparison there is with Captain Sullenberger, right? The Sully Sullenberger, whatever the guy's name is, flew into the Hudson that saved the lives of all the passengers there. And it was the crew effort, of course, right? They emphasized that. But the difference there is event happened, checklist was employed. So I think there's very different ways to go about implementing checklists. And so I can agree with partly what you said, and I can disagree with partly what you said, because I think that StarCraft, if you implement it as like, well, okay, it's minute 2. Let me go through the checklist. Do I have 6 pylons, and have I built, whatever it is that you're doing? I don't think that that's as effective a tool for StarCraft as it could be more the way that aviators use checklists, and that, oh shit, something just happened.
Right.
Now what?
Right.
And I know I'm going on a little bit long here, but like get to your adept build story. So I recently have changed a build order against Zerg, and I've been practicing it and playing it, and it just loses a bunch. And I actually was kind of ready to give up on this build because I was just like, oh, it's no good, and I don't know. There's a whole reason why I'm doing it, and it's a kind of a different discussion. But I think it was on the Pylon show, I heard one of the either in control or one of the guests say something like, yeah, when you do a new build and you're going to just lose the first 15 games you do it. And then they went on to say something else that was completely unrelated to what I was doing. But I was like, oh, yeah, that's right. It does take a long time to learn a build because you have to learn the build in all these different situations which you might encounter. What if the opponent doesn't expand? What if the opponent triple expands? What if the opponent rushes you? What if the opponent's going for, fast 2 or 3 units? What if the opponent's doing whatever? And I have found that the build sort of gets better for, like, at least my experience when I changed up my build. I'm doing this kind of off meta thing that's not really common and maybe not that great, but it's, hey, I'm having fun doing it, so I'm doing it. I have found that I'm sort of still in the stage of accumulating knowledge of, like, what happens when this occurs in the game. Where do I go next? What happens if that occurs? And it's really hard, and I've been really trying to not give up on the build and just revert back to something I know. Because it's very easy to be like, well, this sucks, and I'll just go build Immortal Archon Charge Lot and do a 7-minute timing and whatever. Or I'll just go back to, whatever I used to do 2 months ago. Rather than, no, I'm sticking with the tech choice I made. I'm sticking with the build order I have. I'm going to try and play this out. I don't really know where it goes. And I think that is a good analogy to your adept story. Like, if you see mutas, you have to scout for mutas because you can die to mutas. But if you see mutas, now you have to go down that branch of the build order. Now you've identified it, you know it because you're scouting for it. And when you're learning the game, or you're learning a new way to play the game, you don't necessarily know where that branch is going to take you, right? So if I scout a certain tech choice, it's like, oh shit, I can't actually do what I'm doing, right? So if I'm DT rushing, for example, and they already have detection, you can't do that. I mean, you could, right? But, like, it's not going to work. So now you have to think, what can I do with what the tools I have? And I think that's kind of where checklists are going to, that's my opinion, where checklists kind of can wedge themselves into StarCraft, is that when you have established things well enough that you, and you made a comment about this too, because I think it was really interesting, is that I said something, it's a little bit later on, but we can jump around a little bit in our notes, is a good checklist doesn't need to have things that are never missed or forgotten. And I put warp gate research. And you astutely pointed out that, like, there have been GSL games that have been lost because somebody didn't get warp gate research. And I think it was Creator who did it against Sue or something like that. But the in my head, I was like, well, the things that you don't need to be told to do, you shouldn't have on a checklist. That's what I was getting at.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I wasn't coming at it from a standpoint of I disagree with this point. It was, I don't think this is an example of the thing that you're trying to make it be an example of. Which it's just kind of funny. And I guess just to expand on that for the viewers a little bit, I think in particular, the mechanism that makes people forget warp gate research, and we've seen very good players do this, right? And I know I've done it. I think probably most everyone who has gotten to a level where they start to differentiate their build orders to the point of, I'll talk about a particular nuance, right? Eventually, we all learn, well, if you're going to try to get a quick Stargate, you need to get your warp gate research after that quick Stargate and not before. Whereas your kind of stock standard, I am a Protoss and I plan to do Protoss things, right, that aren't a cannon rush, right? Almost any other thing that you're ever going to do is going to be that warp gate research before your tech, right? And that little thing, what is the thing that immediately precedes my warp gate research, right? Is it that first thing I'm spending gas into or not? I think, at least in my case, it definitely is the mechanism by which you forget warp gate research. Because almost always when you see it, they went Stargate first. And in their head, they're like, okay, I've teched, so I have warp gate already because that's the first thing I spent my gas on. It's kind of whatever. Chat is saying that Terrans do this with combat shield or bane speed for Zergs, which I can't comment on.
I was gonna give the Zerg example, playing a bit more Zerg lately after Castnuts graciously gave me a few pointers and
nice.
spend a little bit of time with me going through some build orders. Is that one of the things in the build that I do, I basically do the same build, pretty much all matchups except for ZVZ, slightly different. But when I do the build with Zerg, the idea is you take some drones off gas once you have enough for ling speed. But that's right about the time that a Reaper shows up. And it's like this Reaper shows up and you're like, okay, I'm going to get that Reaper. And then all of a sudden, oh, shoot, I didn't bring my guys off gas. So now I have less minerals and I have more gas. And it's sort of when that happens, and the same thing with Warp Gate Research, forgetting that or forgetting Combat Shield or Lord Richard's concussive shells. Then all of a sudden the game starts to take a turn that you weren't expecting.
Yeah.
And you're like, no, it's okay. Everything's fine. And it's like, maybe it's not fine, right? Because like now you're in a territory that you're not really familiar with, and your timings are a little bit off, and we all make mistakes, and that's just how StarCraft goes. But I think that's an interesting thing for me when I forget Warp Gate Research as a Protoss player who plays mostly Protoss, in StarCraft and StarCraft 1, when I forget these kind of key upgrades, it's because an event happened in the game, usually. If I was sitting there on my own, just doing my own thing, then I was fine. And this is what I found. I played one night of Zerg last night or the night before, and there were games where, it's like Diamond 3, so like people aren't super great at macroing and microing at the same time, and so I was just left alone. And I was like, well, I'll get 6 bases, I'll get 80 drones, I was getting my hive, I was doing everything I wanted to do, and my timings felt really nice. I didn't get supply blocked. Meanwhile, when I'm getting attacked and all these things, all of a sudden now I'm getting supply blocked a lot. I'm missing injects. I'm not spreading creep. And those sort of mechanics fall apart. For high-level players, we see it, right? So anybody who's competing in StarCraft for money, they don't forget those things generally, right? They're not really getting supply block. They're not really missing their injects. And Serral is the most extreme example of this. But what I think is so beautiful about the high-level players, Serral, or you could say like Raynor or Showtime or Marine Lord or whatever, any of those really, really high-level guys, is that they effortlessly and cleanly do all the things that I could do if I'm playing against easy AI, but they do it while playing against another top player that's way, way up there. And for them, it's so ingrained, it's so automated. And this is where I think, like, coming back to how checklists can work for us in StarCraft, is that once the task becomes ingrained, like Serral doesn't need a checklist for macro cycles. But I might, because I'm not there yet. And could be something that checklist could be a crutch that you just kind of discard after a while. And we sort of do this with build orders, right? We kind of use them for a while and then we're like, well, I got it. I don't need to look at a build order anymore. So I don't know where it falls in, but I do, I want to hear your thoughts on that. And then I also have a proposal of how I did make a checklist, and this is, I'll tell you how I did it, but I want to hear your thoughts first on that.
Yeah. So, I guess what this really boils down to is like, what is the definition of a checklist, right? And I don't know that the book ever calls it out like in very explicit language, right? Like my takeaway from it was that it is a literal, piece of paper that I have to like make an X, right?
Okay, so you listened to the book and you didn't read the book. In the back of the book, there's an appendix with checklists. And it has different examples from different fields.
Okay.
So I just want to insert that in there. If you do read the book, read all the way to the end. And I can hook you up with like screenshots of those later if you want to air it.
That'd be cool. So that was like, I guess that was my takeaway from it, right? And I guess exercise for me, the reader, to see whether that's true or not. But yeah, I think depending on the definition, right, I would have a different conclusion on, what does the science say about this. For me, I think the reason to drew that conclusion is because he rails so hard against trying to just practice or trying to do stuff in your head, because that is kind of what I think of when I think of, rehearsing my build order. It's like, well, I know that in a PVT, I'm gonna get that charge research real quick out of my Twilight, or I'm gonna rather blink research real quick out of my Twilight. But you know what? There's a Reaper in my base again, the damn Reaper, right? And I'm doing a bad job with my depth. Maybe I let a shade finish that I shouldn't have. And now, son of a bitch is killing 3 probes, and the last thing that's on my mind is starting that research. Even though I hotkeyed the freaking Twilight, and like I could do it while I'm looking at the Adept, right?
Right.
It just it's not in my head. And then I'm like, oh, crap. Okay, well now I can't do my blink pressure, so I didn't start my blink on time. I'm gonna have 3 or 9 stalkers show up that can't do anything except run
Mm-hmm.
away quickly from from the Terran. Like this sucks. Now my charge is late because my blink was late. Now I'm gonna die to
Mm-hmm.
a push. I'm gonna die to the Terran's 2 base push. Right, 2 base tank push. I'm dead, and it's because of the stupid Reaper at the beginning of the game.
Yeah.
So I guess that's to me when I was reading it, his railing against you kind of actually have it here. We didn't read this point, but the thing about checklists helping experts remember important details, right?
Oh yeah.
So you could say that allegedly I should be an expert at when that Reaper is going to come into my base, and that I should still start that blink research. It's an important detail, but I don't do it.
Yeah.
So I guess that was my takeaway. However, all the things that you're saying, when you're saying this is a useful thing and we should do it, I find myself agreeing with. So I think my point of disagreement isn't whether these are helpful things, but rather whether they are they fall under the definition of a checklist or not.
Yeah. And that might be something that I could agree with you as well, is that um there's no really good definition for checklists,
Mm.
because if you do look at the examples in the back of the book, they're pretty different,
Mm.
really pretty different. And in the most minimalist one is the one he talks about where it's I forget the airplane problem that they have, but it's the jet fuel freezing or something
Mm.
like that in the airplane, and the step 2 is just fly,
Mm.
right? If you remember that from the book.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, I think it's the jet fuel freezes and people start freaking out, and they actually forget to keep the airplane steady and level or
Mm-hmm.
whatever when
Mm-hmm.
dealing with this. That checklist is so minimalist.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically turn the switch, pull this back, hit this button, wait 5 seconds, and then restart the engine.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very simple. Whereas if you look at his medical checklist, it's like 3 panels with arrows going
Mm.
across and all sorts of stuff going on. And again, that checklist is meant to be kind of introduced before they start surgery.
Mm-hmm.
So they're doing the thing of like, okay, everybody say your name and your role,
Mm-hmm.
and did you take care of the antibiotics, and did you make sure that you didn't touch anything with your gloves or whatever it is. So I think like in general, the checklist is such a big catch-all term that it doesn't really, like, we could argue of the semantics of it, and I think it's probably not the most helpful term to be
Mm.
using in general
Okay.
for StarCraft. And I would agree with you. It's that uh, if we go about it and say, well, we should basically checklist the whole game, it's literally impossible, right? Because StarCraft has nearly infinite combinations of situations that can occur,
Mm-hmm.
and on top of that, and all the Terrans and Zergs in the world would love Protoss to be nerfed right now,
Mm-hmm.
but Blizzard modifies the game.
Yeah.
So our rules change, which is
Mm-hmm.
totally fine. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But so even if you mapped out everything right now the way it should go in every
Mm-hmm.
single game, it would, 6 months from now, come BlizzCon, whatever, it would change
Mm-hmm.
because they're going to patch things.
Unless
And
Activision completely kills everything, but
until, yeah, they just totally crush everything. Um, but so what I did to create a checklist is I had a night. It was like the perfect night to make a checklist, because I had a night where I played almost 90% or more PVTs.
mm.
That's all I hit. I hit Terran after Terran after Terran after Terran after Terran. And it was perfect because I played more or less the same in each game. I played
Mm-hmm.
more or less the same build. and the Terrans did different things in each build. It was like the perfect night of practice. If you ever get those nights, it's just fantastic because you're just like, oh, this is great. I won a lot of them also because, Protoss Imba, but it was like it was really insightful because it's like, oh, the games I lost, what happened? So I went through those replays. I did this on stream. I think like Lord Richard was in my chat and a couple other people hanging out. I did this in stream and I went through the games and I just said, okay, let's look at the games I lost. What happened? Where were key points that I lost? And I took notes as, okay, this game I got early game rushed and I didn't build a pylon. Okay. And then this game I got, mid game pushed and I took a really bad position and I lost on my unit. And then I looked at the games I won and I said, okay, what were the mistakes that I did in that? Or where could I have improved? Did I take any bad fights? Did I forget stuff? And I wrote down those things. And then from those, I parsed that out into early game, mid game, late game. And I made checklists for each sort of scenario. Okay, if I'm getting harassed, I need to do X, Y, and Z. And I tried to keep it to 3 or 4 things. If I am harassing the opponent, I need to make sure to do X, Y, and Z because I didn't do the chrono or something. And so I would say it was mildly effective because I did this in a Word document and I put it up, on the screen. And then the next day when I played and I hit a Terran, I had this up on my second monitor and I was like, okay, are we in this location? I found a couple things about that really interesting. It was one, it was extremely hard to train myself to look at the checklist while I was playing because it doesn't feel like StarCraft runs at 1,000,000 miles an hour when you're playing it, and then you watch your replays and you're like, boy, this game's so slow.
Back when I was first starting out, like when I first started streaming, I would watch players who were like a league or two better than me, and I would trash talk in my own head, not to anybody else or not in the chat or anything. I'm like, how the hell?
It's not that good.
How the hell are you in platinum? Look at how slow you play. I play way quicker than this. And then I'd go back and watch my stream to like check audio levels, and I'd go, oh.
Yeah.
It's
then the reality hits you.
Yeah, you literally play at like half the speed that it feels like you do. It's absolutely crazy.
It feels like it's a train wreck, and then when you watch it, it's like a slow motion, steam locomotive just barely getting going and just chugging along. You're like, oh, it's not what I thought it was. It's not the Japanese bullet train.
It's funny. It actually makes me sympathize with the Twitch chat, right? Like as streamers, we all love to gripe about the Twitch chat expert being like, do this, do this, do this, right?
Yeah.
But like when you've watched your own VOD and you're doing it to yourself, and like you don't remember the outcome of the game because it was early on in the stream and you've played 10 games since then, you're like, oh my god, I didn't do it. Oh no, I did lose this one.
Yeah, there's nothing more humbling, and I wish more people had the ability and had the chance to stream, because there's really nothing more humbling than streaming and then not only all the stress and pressure of streaming, but then going back and looking at your VODs and being like, oh wow, that's what I did. Okay, no one to blame but myself there.
Yeah.
Well, actively, I do it more than you, but I'm actively like, this is bullshit. Like, you're like, nah, it's not actually. You saw that drop. It was on the mini. You just didn't look at it.
Right. So, if you have a thought, go ahead, because I have a.
Yeah, I was just gonna say. So one thing I found was very hard to train myself to look at the checklist because the game feels so fast. Eventually, though, I think mostly because I went through replays and I wrote things down, and then I wrote down like the solutions to those things, and I stuck with it for a couple days, and then I think that actually helped me, because there were a couple times in a couple games I'm like, oh right, I recognize the situation, and it's the third checklist down on my little Word document. I can glance over, okay, this is the things I need to remember to do, and I did them, and it did help me in some situations, but I think I couldn't parse out in my head whether or not that was just basically me being better about analyzing replays than I had before because I had a systematic way to do it, or if it was necessarily because I made the checklist, or a little both, maybe.
So, okay, I've got thoughts about this. I've got a thing for chat. And I've got to tie into an old episode of the archives. Look at that. Let's see if I can coalesce all that into something.
Segue.
So as you were saying that, what that reminded me of is episode 2, where we discuss Make It Stick, right? And you're doing all of the things in your example that that book says to do, right? You reflected on the thing that happened. You put it in a different medium by writing it down. You then thought about it more after you'd kind of let that settle, right? You
Yeah.
went back and like went back through it. Um, and then you tried to do recall of the information by virtue of the fact that you were having trouble looking over at the checklist, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's really cool from that standpoint. In my chat a while back, Circuit mentioned um, his kind of opinion that the focus should be trying to program the stuff into your mind so you don't have to think about it, right? So all of your examples of like, okay, early game, I got to do this, this, this. Um, my example, as you were saying that, and he was typing that in chat, is actually something that I learned from Pig, which is to identify the things where you slip when pressure is applied to you. So the example that he gave, and this is in like an old Pig Daily from a year or two ago, I don't remember the number of this one, was basically he found in his own play that when he was getting like cheesed out really bad, like some kind of really crazy, proxy bunker pressure or whatever it is, he would always get supply blocked. And
Mm-hmm.
so, excuse me, so he kind of set up a trigger in his head that said, when I'm in this situation, I'm going to dump a bunch of supply because I know I'm going to forget to make pylons, right? Um, and so now I do that. Like I don't even think that I ever had the problem as severely as he did. I had like lots of problems about equally as much, right? But anytime I'm in that scenario, I always think back to that pig story and I'm like, okay, let's just get this one out of the way, right? I'm going to
Yeah.
just dump some supply and now I don't have to worry about getting supply blocked as I'm holding this cheese. Now I just need to worry about, am I making the right tech choices? Am I spending my money? Should I be making workers or not? And what am I doing with my micro? But that supply block piece isn't in there.
Yeah.
Um, so certainly to Circuit's point, how do you drill this stuff in? I think those triggers is one way to do it. And then for you, it seems like the trigger could be like it triggers. Okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this, not just I'm going to dump a bunch of supply. And I could see myself maybe being able to do that potentially.
Yeah. I think that there's a space in the learn. So because the skill ceiling. So let me say this in a different way. If you look at surgery, the win conditions for surgery is your patient recovers and
Mm-hmm.
does not die,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
right? You really don't need to be the greatest surgeon in the world. You
Mm-hmm.
just need the patient to survive and recover,
Right.
and you solve the problem. And in aviation, at least commercial, you just need to get to point A to B. Plane
Mm-hmm.
survives, passengers survive. Hopefully, it was a nice, smooth landing.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there is a high skill ceiling. Obviously, there are pilots who do stunt plane stuff, and but you don't necessarily need to get there.
Mm-hmm.
And the stakes, again, like I said in the earlier, is it's high stakes because people's lives are at risk.
Mm-hmm.
However, for us, the skill ceiling is ever increasing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what's Cyril's MMR now? 7,000 something ridiculously
Yeah.
crazy high,
Right.
and he could keep going up,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like he could keep getting better if he
He's
chooses to continue playing.
he's
Maybe he
actively
is.
trying to, right? Like.
He's actively trying to, and perhaps he is getting better. I mean, he's
Mm-hmm.
last IEM, he was beating people that he had trouble with, or lost a game to previously, and he
Mm-hmm.
was just raffle stomping, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I see that, at least my takeaway to like my closing thoughts for this book are that checklists are really cool. It's another way, and I'm glad you made that connection with Make It Stick because I didn't think of
Mm-hmm.
that, but it's true. It's another way for me to learn, and eventually I probably can just discard some of those checklists because they will be so ingrained. I'll be at the level where I'll do my injects and creep spreading without thinking about it and not missing those when I'm getting attacked
Mm-hmm.
or when I'm defending or when I'm attacking.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not there yet. So I still need to use something as a trigger.
Yeah.
And maybe for me, writing it down in a systematic way works.
Mm-hmm.
And it could, I could completely accept that it might not be that way for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But I could see as in the future of my StarCraft, as I get better and better, and as an aside, like I know that we've talked about getting better and feeling stuck and stuff,
Mm-hmm.
and I've actually really I feel actually quite okay with it, but I've been sitting at 4,000 MMR very consistently for
Mm-hmm.
months now.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember there was a time where I had trouble staying close to 4,000 MMR.
Yep, that's me right now.
And right now I'm like, okay, I can't always stay in Diamond 1, but I can touch Diamond 1 occasionally. I get there. But I don't really drop below 4,000 MMR.
Mm.
Like dropping below 4,000 MMR, I'm like, okay, beat a couple nerds and I'm back up where I should be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I can see that the skill has increased for me, and there are things that I do now that I didn't do before.
Mm-hmm.
I don't forget anymore, et cetera, et cetera. But I think maybe the way that my personality is, because I like to write things down and I like to have, like, I like organization, and it's kind of the way I work.
Mm-hmm.
The checklist thing feels very good. If
Mm.
it tickles a part of my brain that I very much am happy to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that it could be just a combination of these factors, like you're saying, to make it stick, of put it in a different medium and think about it again and recall it again. And all of a sudden,
Mm-hmm.
hey, you
Mm-hmm.
have this new knowledge that you didn't realize. And maybe that is the breakthrough, at least for me, it might be the breakthrough that I needed to continue my learning.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm going to be GM tomorrow, but it's a way for me to continue learning. And it could be a way for other people to continue.
Yeah, for sure. That's cool. This is something I have a really strong interest in. Is like I wish that everybody were as mindful as what you just described, or maybe everybody is, they just don't share it, right? Because they don't have these conversations with enough people, or there's no giant repository for this. But like, I wish that anytime anybody figures something out in StarCraft and jumps up some MMR, that they like identified and wrote down what it was and put it somewhere so that I could look at it, right? Because I bet you there would be a pretty like there would be like a scatter plot of it, right? Where it's like, yeah, there's like some weird stuff that made people improve, but it would be like basically the same stuff, right?
Yeah.
And if I had that, it's so easy to coach people from one league to another. And I think this is where some of the folks in the community who do coach a lot, like Pig does a lot of it, right? I think this is where they actually get a lot of bang for their buck, because it isn't like they're just depending on their ability to be a really good player, a really smart coach, or good with people, or whatever the hell it is. Like, they just actually like have more of that data than the rest of us do,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like, okay, I've seen this before, right?
Yeah.
He talks all the time about players, at our MMR, give or take, however many hundred, usually come to him and they're way more macro focused, or they're way more micro focused. I think this is more true of my MMR than yours. And he's got to kind of nudge him back towards, hey, look, there's kind of two sides of this coin type of thing. And so that's something I'm really interested in. For me in particular, I'm very extreme in that regard. It's like the thing you were talking about earlier, these really strong pro players who can do their macro without dropping anything, whether they're pressuring or being pressured, right? For me, the experience is like every time I move up in MMR a little bit, it's like I have to completely relearn how to do that unit interaction part of the game. And like the
Mm-hmm.
way that I do that is by macroing well up until that happens, and then everything sucks, but I got exposure one time to fighting that Reaper pressure at the beginning of the game.
Yeah.
And if I do that enough times, eventually I'm like, Diamond 2 good at holding that Reaper pressure. And now I can go back to doing the other stuff. But that's like
Right.
so inefficient, right? If you think about, I got to do 3 minutes worth of stuff for some jackass to send a Reaper into my base and then I die, right? Like, and
Yeah.
like you can sit there and chase a Reaper artificially with an adept and try to kill it, but like it's just somehow not the same, right?
Yeah. Well, I think this goes along with when Special, he got pretty far into the GSL recently, right? Like he had a
Mm-hmm.
pretty deep run, and he had a pretty deep run in IEM, last IEM that was in Ukraine. And one of the things he said in his post-game interview was that he was practicing like 30 to 40 games a day, against a specific matchup.
Mm.
And I talked about this with Daw and Kessnuts when we did one of the crafts where we're
Mm-hmm.
drinking beer and just talking about video games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Kessnuts made the kind of interesting point of that you're you can be, if you have somebody that's willing to do it, right, or you have a couple people are willing to do it, play a single
Mm-hmm.
race against you, and they're going to vary their builds accordingly,
Mm-hmm.
but not metagame you.
Right.
It could be really effective training. And I
Mm-hmm.
think this is like what you're getting at is that, well, geez, I have to do, I might see it once a week.
Mm-hmm.
I might see this thing that I'm dying to once a week, and
Yep.
I don't really get to practice against it, but I know it's a big hole in my gameplay and
Mm-hmm.
I need to solve it. And practice partners, although it's hard to get people like that, that's it. I think it can be an effective thing.
Mm-hmm.
And to even take it back to make it stick a little bit is, maybe you need a practice partner that does, kind of the two end members of the
Mm-hmm.
thing you're dying to, and then you practice against that and you kind of learn all the variations. But the latter is, the matchmaker is so good and it's so bad at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's so good because it's like, boom, instant match. It's so bad because you just don't know what you're going to get.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get a wide variety of players and skills and styles, even in the same MMR range.
Mm-hmm.
And
Could be
in
the same
Brood War, it's
player.
even the same player. Yeah,
Yeah.
they can just do something completely off the wall.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's Friday night and they've had a couple beers and all of a sudden they're doing some weird build that like, what is this?
Yeah.
Nothing makes sense,
Right.
And in Brood War, it's even worse, I think, because it's the ladder is a little bit more clunky and there's fewer players, and it's like you just get these wildly different styles
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
wildly different ideas. And so yeah, I guess as a closing idea, like I completely sympathize with that situation, and what makes a good teacher is the one that does have that big database in their either
Mm-hmm.
in their notes or in their head,
Mm-hmm.
and sees where you're at on the curve and say, okay, I'm going to move you now up a point.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
we do have one question in my chat that I'm trying to clarify right now.
yep. So Q&A.
And I was gonna say something and now it's gone. Oh, well.
It's all right. It was a good book to read overall. I'm happy we did it.
Oh,
I'm
yeah.
glad that you went along with the suggestion.
Yeah. So I thought it was really cool. Like I got a ton out of it, just like life in general wise. Like I'm definitely looking for the first spot where and maybe it's whatever new job I take, right? I'm
Yeah.
like getting older, I guess, more senior as a dev or whatever. So like I'm gonna have to maybe be making more of these processes rather than following them, right? Which I don't know, it feels kind of gross to me in a way. That's like totally a tangent. But anyway, maybe it's useful for that. Okay, so the question is basically, if it's true that checklists can handle everything, wouldn't just focusing in on perfect macro yield better results? I have thoughts on that, but do you want to take a stab, Adra?
I guess I would disagree with the premise that checklists can handle everything. I think for StarCraft, and I take it as more the pilot's way of using checklists. Checklists are very good for very specific, unusual events or unexpected events. Maybe is a better way to say it.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're going to have checklists, I feel that checklists should be used in the manner of, maybe I've trained this before, but it was a long time ago, and I don't see this set of circumstances, so I'm going to turn to the checklist so I don't forget a key and important thing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my take on how, so perfect macro and all that. Like, you do internalize stuff, and you do get better at your macro. I think that's obvious as you move up in the ranks. You just get better, and maybe the most inefficient way to do that is just to mass games, which we've talked about a lot on the show. But it does get you better, but you could use checklists in the earlier part of learning the game if you wanted to, and I think then at some point it's totally perfectly fine to throw them away and say, I don't need them anymore.
So the Steve had a really good point as we were talking about this. So as far as my answer, I don't think I can do better than you, so I'm just gonna not.
Okay. I can
But
agree.
the Steve called out that there is this notion of a difference between theory crafting and executing, right? So, if we are just focused on like pen and paper stuff, it's a little bit different because a lot of the tasks that we're talking about in the book are, hey, it isn't that hard to clean the tube that's stuck into somebody who's, sitting in the hospital, but it kind of is hard to, like, I don't know, spread creep in a bunch of places really quickly and then inject all of your bases really quickly. And then also, like, did you just lose your whole army to one Baneling, right? Like,
Yeah.
um, so there's a little bit more of a difficulty there. I don't know. I guess maybe some of the piloting stuff could be a better approximation there.
I
Not
think that
sure.
the checklists complement the practice and training of a
Mm.
StarCraft player more than
Mm-hmm.
anything else. It's
Mm-hmm.
not like we said earlier. There's no silver bullet for being good at StarCraft,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and macro cycles. There are a number of training maps in the arcade. Um, Printf has some stuff that he's put out, right? And those I think are really helpful for improving your coordination, your dexterity, all these things that you do need to have built up as a skill that you can isolate and
Mm-hmm.
practice that can get you sort of the baseline.
Yep.
And then ultimately playing games and getting experience playing and I think Printf would definitely agree with me if he's in chat. I don't know, but like those weird situations are where you gain a lot of skill or you can gain a lot of information about
Mm-hmm.
how you play and how you react under stress. So I think like hotkey trainers and the creep spread trainer and the green micro against banelings,
Mm-hmm.
I think those are valuable to a point. I
Mm-hmm.
don't think that we should do them ad hoc and a million times, but I think they can be valuable, especially when learning the basics of the game.
Yeah.
Um, I
If
know our
you're
book, like it's kind of a gray area though, right? Because it's like you don't want to do too much.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you're targeting a specific skill, and I think this is in line with what the book says. And I see you, Lord Richard. I promise we'll get to you. I'll say one
Yeah, we're
thing,
gonna
not
get
two.
your next question.
Um, so the book doesn't say don't practice, right? It says just practicing more sometimes doesn't get you over the hump, and you need a
Right.
checklist, right? But yeah, as far as like you mentioned the printf stuff. Holy shit, man, he put me out of business. Oh my god, does anybody remember a thing called bite-sized StarCraft 2 that happened once upon a time? It's a YouTube playlist. This guy worked really hard on it.
Yeah.
Holy shit, did he come along and cover much better material, much more succinctly, and it comes with a freaking arcade map for you to practice. I was just like, all right, you win,
Included
Printef.
free
Like,
with the playlist. You get an
yeah.
arcade
Oh my
map.
god. Okay, well, it's yours now.
Capitalism at its best, right?
Yeah. Holy, I can't beat that, dude. Jeez. Rip bite-sized StarCraft 2. It was cool while it lasted. But anyway, okay,
Well,
so
a guy that literally has a spreadsheet for every single game he's ever played and
hmm
lost and why eventually going to come up with something like that, I think.
yeah, just kind of funny. But okay, so for
Lord Richard's question is: do you think that a checklist could be too restrictive to growing as a StarCraft 2 player because it forces you to look at only one aspect that might not be the problem with your playstyle? What do you think, Garrett? Too restrictive?
um it's a good question. I had a similar thought in my head. Because I wanted to challenge my assumption of that you can't do this in StarCraft, right? And so in challenging that assumption, I was like, well, what if I did this, right? I've got three monitors. What if I just wasn't streaming, or I just didn't care about reading chat, or whether the stream was still on, or whatever the hell it is? Um, and I just said, okay, we're gonna we're gonna have like 16 Word documents open. There's gonna be a big ass bold title for each one. It's like base trade, PVT, opponent's doing
Mm-hmm.
this, right? Like it has the three bullet points that I need to care about. And so I do the thing of like you said like the solo, Cessna pilot or whatever it is,
Yeah.
where you're like, flying and you're reading the manual and you're like, okay, I guess I do this, right? Like, I mean, you can try to do that. I think
Yeah.
practically speaking, this is a lot better in scenarios where, okay, there's two people and they're flying a plane, or it's a team
Yeah.
of doctors and nurses, and one of them can be like, "All right, jerks, like it's time to do the checklist." And by the way, they do. I was
Yeah.
going to talk about this, but it's a tangent. But just with my like experience as a somewhat sick person, um, I've actually like experienced a lot of these where it's like, okay, who's the patient, and I have to say my name, right? What are we
Hmm.
doing today, right? What medicine are
Yeah.
we dripping into you, or what procedure is this, or whatever? And and like everybody is like, okay, this is stupid, but I am actually glad they do it, right? Like if they
Yeah.
thought I was some other dude with a similar name, that could be really bad, right? You
It
wake
could be
up and
really bad.
like you know you're missing something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I totally
uh,
went off topic there. I'm sorry, Lord Richard. Um,
oh, I had a thought
yeah,
now,
sure,
and
sure.
it's eluded me as soon as you said that you were the patient, and I was like, oh
I
yeah,
know I
that kind of
ramble too
sucks.
much. Let me
No, it's okay.
let me
It's
try
all right.
to bring back to like what my point was because I went way off the rails there. So
Yeah.
is it too restrictive? My thought was not that it's too restrictive, but rather that it's too broad instead, right? So, like in my example of the freaking 16 Word documents or whatever it is, there's just too many of them looking here and there, and like, oh crap, the PVZ was over in that corner and I didn't see it, and meanwhile I've crashed the plane or run into the banelings or whatever it is.
Yeah.
So that would be my thought. I could be too restrictive for a different person. I'm not sure, but I'm a very like one build order kind of guy, or I like boring samey stuff. So maybe what I
Yeah.
don't find too restrictive could be for somebody else too.
Yeah, I think I guess everybody has their own flavor of StarCraft, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
just go watch. If you don't believe me, go watch Florencio's stream for about a half an hour, and you'll
Yeah.
realize that there's some weird stuff that people do in this
Mm-hmm.
game.
Mm-hmm.
And hey, more power to them. Like if they want to play a certain way, they play a certain way.
Right.
Um, and I think that this gets a little bit at Lord Rich's question: is that, well, what's the ultimate StarCraft 2 player, right? How do we even
Mm-hmm.
define that? Because again, if you look at Haas, I mean, Haas played in the final round against the best player in the world,
Mm-hmm.
and quite possibly the best player in the history of StarCraft, at least the history of StarCraft 2.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can agree with that.
Yeah.
And
And didn't he take
Haas
a map?
faced,
I think he took a
yeah,
map,
he
didn't
took
he?
a
Yeah.
couple maps. He took like
Like
two,
it like
like ridiculous games, with
mm-hmm.
cannon rushes and stuff. And like, okay, they're cannon rushes, but still, he took games. And so, we have to respect that that is a high level of play, no
Mm-hmm.
matter what you say. Like, okay, the dude won, I don't know how much money, but tens of thousands of dollars and went to
Mm-hmm.
BlizzCon because of it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody here, and I mean, how many GMs in chat have been to BlizzCon because they can rush to a high level Zerg? Like,
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah, what's really the ultimate level of skill? And I think, when we learn StarCraft, again, coming back to it, I think a lot of us do turn to Spawning Tool or SC2 stats replays or whatever it is, or Reddit, and we look up build orders and we say, hey, or we post a question on Team Liquid forums and
Mm-hmm.
say, what do I do against the Marauder concussive shell slow push?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What do I do against the proxy hatch? What do I do against a 12 pool or
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is? And we learn a series of steps to counteract that.
Right.
And I think, me looking at it from my perspective in Diamond, where I'm at, it seems to me right now that I don't need to go through those type of checklists. I don't
Mm-hmm.
need to go through those sort of semantics, but I can benefit a lot from saying, okay, in these certain situations, there are some important things not to forget.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way I take it. And I could, so not maybe not many of us have flown a plane, but probably most every one of us has driven a car.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to have a checklist to turn the engine on and back the car out of a parking spot,
Mm-hmm.
because we've learned that. So much so that we can do it pretty much while listening to music and talking to our friend.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the way I take it, and I'm totally open to being wrong about that, but I still think it's interesting. I'm glad that people are interested in having the discussion about it.
Mm-hmm. Just tagging on really quickly to the car thing. For me, I actually do have a couple of little like one item mental checklists, right? Which is okay, people in front of you stop suddenly, stand on the brake, right? Or
Yeah.
pump the brakes, depending on which school of thought you come from, right? Or which way
Yeah.
you were taught, right? That's another holy war that we won't get into, but it's one of those two, right?
Right.
Another one, you're hydroplaning, right? You have to accelerate out of it. You can't brake. It's not gonna fix it. I've had both of those happen, right? And I don't know why I remembered the one item in my checklist or whatever, but like I could actually be alive because I remembered that, right? Which is
Mhm.
kind of interesting.
Yeah. When I moved here to Michigan, I actually YouTube videos about what to do when you start sliding on ice.
Mm,
Because I mean, it's a real thing,
mm-hmm,
especially black ice.
mm,
And there's actually some pretty good advice on YouTube, some safety videos people put up, and
mm-hmm,
certain speeds that you should drive, and
hmm,
steering into a spin or out of a spin, and what
hmm,
happens when you do that. And I've experienced that. I mean, I think if you just live in a snowy area like I do, you're going to experience sliding on ice,
mm,
very slow speeds, but yeah, you can kind of feel how the car turns, and you start to learn like, okay, I need to do this, and you ingrain the actions. But when I first moved here, I definitely did that, and I
mm-hmm,
definitely would remember, and I would get a little bit stressed out, like, okay, it's icy and snowing, and
mm-hmm,
I hope that they've salted the roads really well, and like I hope I don't slide off the road, and I
mm-hmm,
haven't, but it's something that I did have to learn,
mm,
and now I don't think about it as much because I've lived up here a few years now. But um, it's yeah, it was a change in my behavior because like you, I lived basically out in the Southwest my
mm-hmm,
whole life, and uh, I don't even know what the hell snow is, right? Like,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
so um, yeah, I don't have any more questions. Lord Richard just added that the checklist of do I have my keys before I lock my car doors and leave. Yeah, that's an
Right.
important one.
Yeah, I've done that one. That one sucks. Yeah, Circuit was saying there's a little bit of a difference between like this type of feeling by learning versus learning from a checklist, right? Which that's definitely true. That's
Yeah,
back to the one thing you can do is freaking grind games, right?
yeah.
And that will get you there for certain things. You just might have to
It's
play a lot.
yeah,
Like
20,000 games later, you'll
yeah,
eventually get there, right? Or maybe
yeah.
1,000. No,
Mm-hmm. So I
yeah,
guess closing stuff. One of the things that I would maybe like soft announce for the 10 or so of you lovely folks who are hanging out with us tonight is that we want to do this more often. As Adressa said earlier, we just due to like scheduling and stuff, and then my life being kind of a mess right now, took kind of a long time to get this one out. But I was commenting to him that this is like actually one of my favorite things that I do. Getting to both talk to Adraseth, but also everybody in the chat. Like we didn't have a ton of people tonight, but it didn't feel like that to me. It like the chat was super active. I think better than it's
good
been,
discussion.
yeah, and any of the other episodes we've had. So yeah, it's something I want to do more of. I have also said like I wouldn't mind getting a second crack at the inner game of tennis somewhere down the line, but there's so many other books that I want to do. It would be like it's episode 100 type
Yeah,
stuff, right? But yeah, I think we have a big enough backlog of books, and there are enough other people in the community who want to recommend books and that kind of thing that we want to do it more. And yeah, I don't know. I think it'll be good. So we're thinking like maybe monthly ish.
yeah. And I think also we've discussed this, and to hype an announcement of an announcement. We also are planning to have some guests on, so
Mm-hmm.
we'll have some. It'll be us, but some other people too in the future, and hopefully we can get that scheduled up
Mm-hmm.
sooner in the summer and stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
look forward to that, and appreciate everybody for hanging out and discussing. And yeah, as far as discussion goes, we love to have the questions at the end and see
Mm-hmm.
what you guys are thinking because we make the content for the community.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.